"That's my son," my husband said with a smile that used to belong to me. Those 4 words ended a marriage I had spent 12 years protecting, and the strangest part wasn't that he was holding another woman's baby. It was that he had no idea he was standing inside a company that had never truly belonged to him. People think betrayal happens in dramatic moments, with shouting, broken promises, and doors slamming. The truth is much quieter. Sometimes it arrives in a warm executive lounge overlooking Manhattan, beneath crystal lights and floor-to-ceiling windows, where everyone is dressed in tailored suits and expensive smiles. Sometimes it begins with applause. I was 7 months pregnant when I walked into Holloway Dynamics that Tuesday morning. My doctor had told me to slow down, avoid unnecessary stress, and focus on our daughter. Nathan insisted everything at the office was under control. He even kissed my forehead before leaving home and told me to rest. Looking back now, I realize he wasn't trying to comfort me. He was making sure I wouldn't arrive early. The elevator doors opened onto the executive floor, and something immediately felt wrong. The receptionist, who normally greeted me with effortless warmth, froze the instant she saw me. 2 assistants exchanged nervous glances before pretending to organize files that didn't need organizing. Conversations stopped in the middle of sentences. Even the soft piano music drifting through the lobby suddenly felt too loud. No one said a word, but everyone looked as if they had witnessed something they hoped I wouldn't see. Then I heard laughter. Nathan's laughter. It echoed from the private family lounge at the end of the hallway, the room he always claimed was reserved for investors and confidential meetings. The door stood slightly open. I remember placing one hand over my stomach as our daughter stretched beneath my dress, almost as if she sensed my heartbeat changing. I told myself there had to be an explanation. There always was. I had spent years explaining away late meetings, canceled anniversaries, forgotten birthdays, and business trips that somehow lasted longer than scheduled. Love has a remarkable way of convincing intelligent people to ignore obvious truths. I stepped closer. Through the narrow opening, I saw Nathan sitting beside Olivia Mercer. She looked radiant, dressed in cream-colored designer clothes, smiling with the confidence of someone who believed she already owned the future. Resting peacefully in Nathan's arms was a baby boy no older than 6 months. Nathan gently adjusted the little blanket around him and whispered, "There's my little champion." Olivia laughed softly before brushing invisible lint from Nathan's jacket, as though they had rehearsed the gesture 1,000 times. Then one of the senior vice presidents walked into the room carrying a bottle of champagne. "Congratulations again," he said. "Your family is beautiful." Nathan grinned without hesitation. "Thank you. It finally feels complete." Complete. The words settled into my chest with surprising calm. Not anger. Not panic. Just clarity. Nobody noticed me standing outside the doorway. Nobody realized the wife they believed had been replaced had already heard enough. I could have walked in. I could have demanded answers. I could have reminded everyone that I was still Mrs. Holloway. Instead, I quietly slipped my wedding ring from my finger. It rested in my palm, catching the morning sunlight for one last second before I placed it on the receptionist's marble desk without saying a single word. She stared at it, then at me, unable to speak. I simply smiled, thanked her for everything she had always done for me, and walked back toward the elevators. Behind me, the celebration continued. Ahead of me waited a phone call that would change every life inside that building before the week was over. Because Nathan Holloway believed he was introducing the company to his future. He never stopped to wonder who had owned its past all along. The drive home should have taken 25 minutes, but I barely noticed the streets passing outside my window. New York moved exactly as it always had. Yellow taxis filled the intersections. Office workers hurried across crosswalks with coffee cups in their hands. Construction crews shouted above the endless rhythm of traffic. The city had no idea that an entire life had quietly collapsed inside one glass tower. My phone vibrated 6 times before I finally looked down. Nathan. 3 missed calls. 2 text messages. 1 voicemail. I did not open any of them. For years I had answered every call before the second ring. I had canceled dinners, postponed vacations, and ignored my own needs because his schedule always came first. This time, silence felt like the only honest answer I had left. When I reached our townhouse on the Upper East Side, I walked through the front door and stopped in the foyer. Family photographs lined the staircase exactly where I had placed them. There we were smiling on Nantucket. another from Aspen, one from our 10th anniversary charity gala. Looking at those pictures now was like looking at strangers who happened to share our faces. Every smile carried a story I had rewritten in my mind to make it happier than it truly was. Margaret, our longtime housekeeper, appeared from the kitchen carrying a basket of folded towels. The moment she saw my face, she quietly set everything down. "Mrs. Holloway, are you all right?" she asked. I forced the smallest smile I could manage. "I will be." She nodded without another question. That was one of the reasons I trusted Margaret. She understood that kindness sometimes meant allowing someone to remain silent. Upstairs, I stepped into the nursery we had spent months preparing. Pale green walls, a white rocking chair beside the window, tiny books already arranged alphabetically on the shelves because Nathan once joked that our daughter deserved an organized beginning. I rested both hands on my stomach as she shifted gently beneath my dress. "I promise," I whispered, "your life will never depend on someone else's honesty." The room stayed quiet except for the distant sound of rain beginning against the windows. My eyes drifted toward an old cedar chest tucked beneath the nursery bookshelf. Nathan had never paid attention to it. He assumed it contained baby blankets from my childhood. In reality, it held something entirely different. I knelt slowly, unlocked the brass latch, and lifted the lid. Inside rested neatly organized folders, each protected inside archival sleeves. Original incorporation papers, stock certificates, trust agreements, handwritten letters. Every document carried dates that stretched back more than a decade, long before Holloway Dynamics became a recognizable name on Wall Street. Sitting on top was an ivory envelope addressed in my father's unmistakable handwriting. I had not opened it in almost 4 years. My fingers traced the faded ink before I unfolded the letter once again. "Claire," it began, "if you are reading this, then circumstances have finally required you to remember something I hoped you would never need. Wealth is easiest to protect when nobody realizes who truly controls it. Power should never be confused with attention. The loudest person in the room is rarely the one making the final decision." I closed my eyes as memories returned with startling clarity. 12 years earlier, Holloway Dynamics had not occupied a skyscraper. It had operated from a rented warehouse in Brooklyn with outdated computers and unpaid invoices stacked across folding tables. Nathan possessed ambition, confidence, and extraordinary sales instincts. What he did not possess was enough capital to survive another quarter. My father saw potential where banks saw risk. He offered help under one condition. Nathan could lead the company. He could build it, expand it, and become its public face. But ownership would remain somewhere no competitor, creditor, or future spouse would ever think to search. Nathan accepted every page without reading the details. He celebrated what he believed was a rescue. He never realized the signatures that saved his future quietly created mine. The letter rested quietly in my hands, but every sentence seemed louder than the traffic outside my window. My father had always believed that the strongest foundations were the ones nobody noticed. He built businesses the same way other people built families, with patience, discipline, and promises that survived long after handshakes faded. When he passed away 5 years earlier, the newspapers remembered him as a respected investor with an unusually private life. They never discovered his greatest investment had been the future of a company the world believed belonged to someone else. I carefully returned the letter to its envelope before opening the second folder inside the cedar chest. The first page carried the original trust agreement dated 12 years earlier. My name appeared beside every signature that mattered. Beneath it sat a sealed amendment signed 3 years after Nathan and I married. I remembered asking my father why he had insisted on updating the documents. He only smiled and poured another cup of coffee before saying, "Success changes people faster than failure ever does." At the time, I thought he was simply being cautious. Now I understood he had been preparing me for a conversation he hoped would never become necessary. My phone vibrated again. This time it was not Nathan. The screen displayed a familiar name that I had not needed to call in almost 2 years. Daniel Whitmore, my father's attorney. I answered before the second ring. "Claire," he said gently, "I had a feeling I would hear from you soon." I looked toward the rain sliding across the nursery window. "How did you know?" A brief silence followed before he replied. "Because your father believed there would come a day when you stopped protecting everyone except yourself." His words settled over me with unexpected comfort. Daniel had worked beside my father for more than 30 years. He knew every clause, every signature, every hidden safeguard that had quietly protected Holloway Dynamics from hostile investors and reckless decisions. More importantly, he knew exactly why everything had been structured the way it was. "Has anyone contacted the trust?" I asked. "Not yet," he answered. "Which means Nathan still believes he owns the company." I closed my eyes. He introduced another family inside the executive lounge today. Daniel did not interrupt. He simply allowed the silence to breathe. I walked away. I continued. "You made the correct decision," he finally said. "People reveal far more when they believe nobody is watching." His confidence reminded me of my father. Neither man ever rushed important moments. They understood that timing often mattered more than emotion. Daniel asked if I still had the founder documents. I glanced toward the open cedar chest. "Every page." "Good. Keep them exactly where they are. Tomorrow morning, I want you to meet me at the Whitmore and Associates office at 9 o'clock. Bring the original trust binder, the incorporation papers, and your father's letter. There are several people who need to remember how Holloway Dynamics actually survived its first year." After we ended the call, I sat quietly beside the nursery window while evening settled across Manhattan. My thoughts drifted back to those early years when Nathan and I shared a tiny apartment in Brooklyn. We celebrated every new client with takeout pizza because neither of us could afford restaurants. He used to tell everyone that I was his lucky charm because every important breakthrough seemed to happen after I offered encouragement. What he never realized was that many of those breakthroughs had invisible help. When payroll came up short, anonymous bridge financing appeared through private investment channels. When suppliers threatened to cancel contracts, emergency guarantees quietly arrived from institutions that trusted only one family name. Nathan believed he had conquered impossible odds through determination alone. I never corrected him because I genuinely wanted him to succeed. Somewhere along the journey, however, gratitude slowly transformed into entitlement. Confidence became arrogance. Partnership became ownership. He stopped asking how impossible problems kept solving themselves. He simply assumed the world had finally recognized his brilliance. Tomorrow, for the first time in 12 years, someone was going to place the complete story in front of him. And the most astonishing part was that every signature proving the truth had been waiting patiently all along. The following morning arrived with an unusual kind of calm, the kind that appears just before everything changes. Manhattan looked polished after the overnight rain, its streets reflecting the early sunlight like sheets of glass. I dressed more simply than I had for any corporate event in years. A navy maternity dress, low heels my doctor approved, and a cream-colored coat that my mother had given me before she passed away. I was no longer trying to look like the wife of a celebrated chief executive. I simply wanted to look like myself again. Daniel Whitmore was already waiting when I stepped into the conference room at Whitmore and Associates. The polished oak table was covered with carefully organized folders, legal binders, and several sealed envelopes bearing the Holloway Dynamics corporate seal. Beside him sat Eleanor Brooks, the senior trustee who had quietly managed my family's trust for more than 2 decades. Nathan had met her only once at a charity dinner years earlier. He assumed she was one of my father's retired friends. He had never asked another question. Eleanor stood and embraced me gently before looking at my growing stomach with a warm smile. "Your father would be proud of the woman you became," she said softly. I smiled, although the words carried more weight than I was prepared to admit. Daniel slid a thick binder toward me. "Before we move forward, there is something you need to see." Inside were records that had never crossed my desk before. Quarterly reports from the trustee's office. Internal governance reviews. Confidential correspondence between the trust and Holloway Dynamics. As I turned each page, one pattern became impossible to ignore. During the past 18 months, Nathan had begun making increasingly aggressive decisions without trustee approval. Luxury acquisitions that produced little value. Executive bonuses that exceeded board recommendations. Personal travel billed to corporate accounts under vague business descriptions. None of the individual expenses threatened the company, but together they painted a picture of someone who had started believing oversight no longer applied to him. "We monitored everything," Daniel explained. "The trust allows operational freedom until fiduciary responsibility is placed at risk. We hoped he would correct course before intervention became necessary." Eleanor folded her hands calmly. Unfortunately, yesterday changed the legal landscape. I looked up. Because of Olivia? She nodded once. Not because of the relationship itself. Personal decisions are not our concern. The problem is that he publicly represented another household while preparing to execute executive succession documents under the assumption that he possessed ownership authority he does not legally hold. The room fell silent. For the first time, I realized this was no longer simply about my marriage. Nathan had unknowingly crossed into decisions that affected shareholders, trustees, and governance obligations established long before he ever occupied the corner office. Daniel opened another envelope and placed a meeting agenda in front of me. At the top were 4 words that immediately caught my attention. Special board session, scheduled for Friday morning. 48 hours away. Nathan requested this meeting himself, Daniel said. He intends to introduce a major restructuring proposal and formally announce changes to executive leadership. My heart skipped. Does the board know? They believe he has complete authority. Eleanor answered with remarkable composure. By Friday morning, they will discover otherwise. My phone lit up once again with Nathan's name. This time the message was longer. Claire, please answer me. You misunderstood everything. We need to talk before people start making assumptions. I read every word without feeling the urge to respond. Yesterday, I might have accepted another explanation. Another carefully assembled version of reality. Today, the documents spread across the conference table spoke more honestly than any conversation ever could. Daniel quietly reached across the table and turned my phone face down. Do not interrupt someone while they are revealing who they truly are, he said. Every hour he believes he is still in control creates another record that confirms exactly how much authority he never possessed. Outside the conference room, the city continued its ordinary routine. Investors hurried into meetings. Markets opened on schedule. Employees walked through the revolving doors of Holloway Dynamics, expecting another normal business day. None of them knew that somewhere inside a law office only 6 blocks away, the real owner of the company had just agreed to attend a board meeting that would leave an entire room questioning everything they believed about the empire they thought they understood. By Thursday afternoon, my disappearance had become the biggest unanswered question inside Holloway Dynamics. I had not returned a single call, responded to a single message, or posted anything online. The silence unsettled people far more than any public argument ever could. Rumors rushed through the executive floors faster than official announcements. Some believed I had left the city. Others whispered that I had already filed for divorce. A few insisted I had suffered a medical emergency because of the pregnancy. None of them came close to the truth. I spent the day exactly where my father would have wanted me to be, inside a quiet conference room reviewing facts instead of emotions. Daniel, Eleanor, and 2 senior forensic accountants had transformed the room into a timeline stretching across 12 years of corporate history. Every acquisition, every shareholder vote, every amendment, every executive contract had been carefully arranged in chronological order. Nothing about this meeting felt dramatic. It felt precise. That was far more powerful. Around noon, Eleanor slid another folder toward me. These arrived this morning, she said. Inside were copies of emails exchanged between Nathan and the corporate communications department. He had instructed them to prepare a press release introducing what he described as the next chapter of leadership and family values. Attached to the draft was an invitation for Friday evening's charity gala, where he planned to present Olivia publicly as part of his future. My eyes stopped on one sentence that immediately caught my attention. Nathan had authorized the announcement under the title of majority owner and chairman. Daniel quietly folded his hands. That title does not legally belong to him. I looked across the table. Can he publish it? He can try, Daniel answered calmly. Every document he signs using authority he does not possess becomes additional evidence that he exceeded his governance rights. I leaned back in my chair, suddenly realizing that Nathan had unknowingly been documenting his own mistakes one signature at a time. No one had encouraged him. No one had trapped him. He simply believed no one would ever question him. Late that afternoon, another unexpected visitor arrived. Harold Simmons, one of the original board members who had worked beside my father since the company's earliest days, quietly entered the conference room carrying a worn leather briefcase. He looked at me for a long moment before smiling kindly. You remind me of your father today, he said. Calm on the outside. already 5 steps ahead on the inside. Harold opened his briefcase and removed a faded photograph. It showed a tiny warehouse in Brooklyn with 6 folding chairs, 1 coffee machine, and a handmade sign reading Holloway Dynamics. Standing in the center were my father and Nathan, both 20 years younger. My father had one hand resting on Nathan's shoulder, smiling with unmistakable pride. "Your father believed Nathan deserved an opportunity," Harold said quietly. "He never intended for gratitude to become ownership." I stared at the photograph, remembering that tiny office where dreams had seemed larger than the building itself. Somewhere along the way, success had rewritten the story in Nathan's own mind until he genuinely believed he had built everything alone. My phone buzzed once again. This time it was a voice message. Nathan sounded exhausted. "Claire, if this is about what you saw, please let me explain. Things are not what they looked like. I know you are angry, but do not disappear like this. We have too much to lose." I listened to the recording only once before placing the phone back on the table. Daniel studied my expression without speaking. Finally, I looked up and quietly said, "He is right about one thing." Everyone turned toward me. "We do have too much to lose." Eleanor gave a small nod. "Then tomorrow we make sure only the people who forgot the truth lose their illusions." Outside, Friday morning crept closer with every passing hour. Nathan believed he was preparing for the most important presentation of his career. He had no idea that another presentation, supported by 12 years of untouched legal records and one forgotten promise, was already waiting for him inside the same boardroom. Friday arrived beneath a pale gray sky that made Manhattan feel strangely restrained, as though even the city understood something irreversible was about to happen. I woke before sunrise without needing an alarm. For the first time in days, I had slept peacefully, not because my problems had disappeared, but because uncertainty had finally been replaced by truth. My daughter shifted gently beneath my heart as I stood beside the nursery window watching the first lights appear across the skyline. "Today," I whispered, resting one hand over my stomach, "you will learn that quiet people are not powerless." By 7:30, I was already inside Daniel Whitmore's office. The conference table that had been covered with documents yesterday now held only 3 leather binders. Everything unnecessary had been removed. Daniel believed clarity was the strongest form of preparation. Eleanor Brooks arrived carrying a sealed Navy portfolio embossed with the family trust insignia. She placed it carefully in front of me before speaking. "Everything inside has been verified 3 separate times. Original signatures, corporate registrations, trustee resolutions, founder agreements. Nothing here can be challenged on authenticity." I nodded slowly, surprised by how little fear remained inside me. I had spent years believing courage meant fighting loudly. Instead, I was discovering that real confidence often arrived without raising its voice. Daniel opened the first binder. "There is one final safeguard your father added after the trust amendment." He slid a single page across the table. The heading immediately caught my attention: Emergency Governance Activation. I scanned the document twice before looking back at him. "This allows the trustees to suspend executive authority?" "Temporarily," Daniel answered. "Only when documented evidence shows the acting executive exceeded the legal authority granted by the trust." Eleanor added quietly, "The authority does not disappear forever. It simply returns to the lawful owner until governance is restored." I understood immediately. This had never been designed as punishment. It existed to protect the company from any individual who confused leadership with ownership. My father had anticipated every possibility years before any of us imagined we would need these protections. At 8:15, Harold Simmons joined us once again. This time he carried a slim envelope instead of his old briefcase. "I almost forgot," he said with an apologetic smile. "Your father asked me to deliver this only if the trust was ever activated." I carefully unfolded the handwritten note. It contained only one sentence: "Do not win because someone else failed. Win because you remembered who you have always been." I smiled through the sudden warmth gathering in my eyes. Even now, years after his passing, my father somehow knew exactly what I needed to hear. There was no encouragement to seek revenge, no invitation to humiliate anyone, only a reminder that dignity always outlasted pride. At precisely 8:45, Daniel's assistant entered carrying a tablet. "The board members are beginning to arrive," she announced. She connected the device to the conference room screen. The building security cameras quietly displayed the executive lobby inside Holloway Dynamics. Directors stepped through the revolving doors one after another. Financial officers greeted investors. Assistants distributed meeting packets. Everything appeared completely ordinary until another familiar figure entered the frame. Nathan walked confidently across the marble lobby, wearing his favorite navy suit. Olivia followed several steps behind in an elegant white dress, smiling politely at everyone who congratulated them. Nathan accepted every handshake with complete confidence. He looked exactly like a man preparing to celebrate the greatest achievement of his professional life. He had absolutely no reason to suspect that the leather portfolio resting beside me contained documents capable of rewriting every assumption inside that building. Daniel muted the camera feed before closing the tablet. "It is time," he said simply. We gathered the three binders, the trust portfolio, and my father's letter. Nothing more was needed. No dramatic speeches had been rehearsed. No elaborate strategy remained. The truth required very little decoration. As we stepped into the elevator leading toward the underground parking garage, my reflection caught my attention in the polished steel doors. I no longer looked like the frightened woman who had quietly left her wedding ring on a marble reception desk 3 days earlier. I looked like someone finally prepared to stop hiding the life she had spent years protecting. And somewhere 20 floors above us, a boardroom filled with confident executives was only minutes away from discovering that the most important person in the company had been underestimated from the very beginning. The silence inside the boardroom lasted several long seconds after Daniel finished presenting the final trust resolution. No one reached for a phone. No one interrupted. Even the soft hum of the climate control system suddenly seemed louder than the people around the table. Nathan remained standing beside the presentation screen, his confident expression slowly giving way to confusion as he looked from one director to another, searching for someone willing to dismiss everything they had just heard. Instead, every pair of eyes turned toward the leather portfolio resting in front of me. Nathan cleared his throat and forced a polite smile that did not reach his eyes. "There has to be some misunderstanding," he said carefully. "I have served as chief executive officer for 12 years. Every major expansion, every acquisition, every investor presentation has carried my signature." Daniel nodded respectfully. "That is correct. You served as chief executive officer with the authority granted by the ownership trust. The documents presented today do not dispute your leadership. They clarify your legal authority." Nathan shook his head. "That is impossible." Eleanor Brooks quietly opened the Navy portfolio and removed one final document sealed with the original corporate embossing from 12 years earlier. She slid it across the polished table until it stopped directly in front of Nathan. "Please examine page 4, she said. Nathan picked up the document with steady hands, but as his eyes moved across the paragraphs, the confidence in his posture slowly disappeared. He reached the signature page, stared at the familiar handwriting, then immediately turned back to the beginning as though hoping the words would somehow change. They did not. Every clause confirmed the same reality. The trust owned the controlling shares. The trust named one permanent beneficiary. That beneficiary was Claire Ellington. Harold Simmons quietly adjusted his glasses before speaking for the first time since the meeting began. "I attended the signing myself. Your mentor insisted that the company needed someone capable of building it and someone capable of protecting it. He believed those responsibilities should never depend on the same person." Nathan looked toward Harold in disbelief. "You knew?" Harold answered honestly. "I always knew." Nathan slowly lowered the papers onto the table. Across the room, Olivia's confident smile had completely disappeared. She had entered the meeting expecting to witness a celebration of Nathan's future. Instead, she found herself watching 12 years of assumptions quietly unravel one document at a time. One of the independent directors finally broke the silence. "Daniel, are these records fully verified?" Daniel slid 3 notarized certifications across the table. "Every signature has been authenticated. Every corporate filing has been independently confirmed. Certified copies have also been filed with the appropriate authorities." Another director looked toward me. "Mrs. Ellington, why did you never tell anyone?" I paused before answering. "Because my father believed that ownership should protect people, not impress them. He taught me that real security works best when nobody feels the need to announce it." The room grew quiet again. Nathan slowly took a seat for the first time since the meeting began. He looked older than he had only 30 minutes earlier. Not defeated, but confronted by a truth he had never imagined questioning. "Claire," he said softly, "why did you wait until now?" I met his eyes without anger. "Because until this week, I believed you still remembered why the company existed." His shoulders lowered as though the answer carried more weight than any legal document. Daniel then addressed the board one final time. Under the emergency governance activation authorized within the trust agreement, executive authority now returns to the lawful owner pending board review. Daily operations will continue without interruption. Employee contracts remain protected. Client agreements remain valid. The only change today concerns legal authority. Relief spread across several faces around the table. The company itself had not been placed at risk. Its future remained stable. The illusion surrounding its ownership had simply ended. Eleanor carefully closed the Navy portfolio before placing it in front of me. "Mrs. Ellington," she said warmly, "on behalf of the trustees, welcome back to the position your father always hoped you would never need to claim." I rested one hand gently across my growing stomach and looked around the room that had once believed I was merely the quiet wife standing beside a successful executive. No applause followed. None was necessary. The truth had spoken clearly enough, and for the first time since I walked away from the executive lounge, I no longer felt like someone reclaiming what had been lost. I felt like someone finally allowing the world to see what had quietly belonged to me all along. When the meeting finally ended, no one rushed toward the exit. Directors remained seated in thoughtful silence, studying the documents that had quietly rewritten 12 years of corporate history. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan continued moving with its usual confidence, unaware that one of its most admired companies had just remembered who truly carried its foundation from the very beginning. I slowly gathered the leather portfolio, my father's letter, and the original trust binder before standing. The weight in my hands felt surprisingly light. For years I had believed those documents represented a responsibility I hoped never to carry. Now they felt like a promise finally fulfilled. Nathan remained seated at the far end of the conference table. The room gradually emptied until only the two of us remained. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. There was nothing left to argue about. The facts had already spoken with more honesty than either of us could have managed. Finally, he looked toward me. "I spent years believing I built everything," he admitted quietly. "Maybe I stopped asking who helped me because I liked the answer I created for myself." His voice carried no anger, only exhaustion. I rested one hand gently over my stomach before answering. "You did build something remarkable. I never wanted to take that away from you." He looked confused. "Then why does this feel like I have lost everything?" I glanced toward the skyline beyond the windows where sunlight now reflected across hundreds of buildings. "Because you confused ownership with gratitude. One can be written on paper. The other has to be protected every day." Nathan lowered his eyes. For the first time since I had known him, he seemed less interested in defending himself than in understanding how he had arrived there. After another quiet moment, he asked the question that had probably been waiting inside him for years. "Did you ever plan to tell me?" I smiled gently. "I planned to spend the rest of my life never needing to." The answer settled between us without bitterness. It was simply the truth. I turned toward the door, but before leaving I placed my wedding ring on the polished conference table beside him. It was the same ring I had quietly removed 3 days earlier. "This belongs to our past," I said softly. "Our daughter deserves something better than pretending." Nathan looked at the ring, but made no attempt to reach for it. He understood that some decisions could not be negotiated once trust disappeared. As I stepped into the hallway, dozens of employees looked up from their desks. Their expressions carried curiosity, uncertainty, and quiet respect. News had already begun spreading through the building, but nobody whispered as I passed. They simply nodded politely. Many of them had known me only as the quiet woman who occasionally visited the office with homemade cookies during the holidays or handwritten thank you notes after company milestones. They had never imagined I was the person who had silently protected their workplace long before most of them were hired. Harold Simmons caught up with me near the elevators. "Your father always believed character revealed itself when power finally arrived," he said with a warm smile. "Today you proved he was right." I thanked him before stepping into the elevator. As the doors slowly closed, I caught one final glimpse of the executive floor that had shaped so much of my adult life. Surprisingly, I felt no desire for revenge. Winning had never been about watching someone else lose. It had been about refusing to lose myself. A few weeks later, the board officially confirmed a new governance structure. Experienced executives continued leading daily operations, employees kept their jobs, and clients experienced no disruption. Stability, not spectacle, became the company's greatest victory. On a quiet autumn afternoon, I returned to the nursery at home. Sunlight spilled across the rocking chair while I folded tiny baby blankets waiting for my daughter to arrive. My father's letter rested on the bookshelf beside me. I read the final sentence one last time before placing it back inside its envelope. Real wealth is measured by the lives you protect, not the titles you collect. I smiled as my daughter kicked gently beneath my heart. One day she would inherit more than a successful company. She would inherit the lesson that silence is not weakness, kindness is not surrender, and the strongest people never need to announce their strength, because when the truth finally walks into the room, it speaks loudly enough for everyone.